Do you still believe that God isn't seeing everything? The question hung silently in the air, long before anyone dared to voice it. There was something in that moment, in that room, in that face creased with arrogance, that seemed to demand an answer from the heavens. The cafe was crowded on that grey Wednesday morning. The fine rain scratched at the windows like impatient fingers. The customers, bundled up, immersed themselves in screens and empty conversations, until the sharp silence of a venomous phrase made time stand still. "If you're so smart, then translate." The voice came from an elderly lady, elegant, with a gleaming gold brooch pinned to her beige coat, a famous widow in the city, heiress to a fortune, widow of a federal judge, and sick with her own vanity. Standing before her, steadying 2 coffee cups with a firm hand, was Amara. Young, black, thin, her hair tied in a makeshift bun, her expression serene, but her eyes, those eyes, were alight like embers that refused to die under ash. She didn't respond. Not yet. The silence that formed there was more eloquent than any word. Amara hadn't chosen that shift. She'd swapped with a colleague who needed to take her son to the doctor. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning. Some toast, coffees ordered with absurd demands, the occasional compliment slipped among meager tips. But it wasn't. Because that morning, amid the metallic clatter of cutlery and the smell of burnt croissants, a powerful woman decided to amuse herself with what she didn't understand. And Amara, with her quiet intelligence, would be the mirror she couldn't bear to see. The old lady, everyone called her Senora Lucille, didn't ask, she provoked. She pointed to the international newspaper open in front of her and said loudly, for all to hear, "Waitress, you who seem to like books, translate this paragraph here. Let's see if you know more than serving coffee." The nearby tables fell quiet. A middle-aged man coughed. A woman beside her dropped her phone onto her lap. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. But Amara didn't retreat, nor did she advance. She simply stood there, with the firmness of someone who carries far more than trays. And that was the first shock for Lucille. Behind that young face were layers no one there knew. Amara had grown up in a community where books were scarce, but the hunger for knowledge was the only constant sustenance. Her mother had taught her to read with market flyers and verses taped to the door. At 10, she read Shakespeare hidden among boxes in the storage room of the public school. At 14, she wrote summaries for white classmates in exchange for peace. At 17, she was accepted into literature at the Federal University, but had to pause her studies because of household debts. She went to work, first in a laundromat, then as a nanny, then as a waitress, and in every place she read translations, essays, psalms, letters. She taught herself French, learned English by correcting pirated e-books, and learned Italian trying to understand an old prayer book she found in the dumpster behind the library. But none of that fit into a 5-second response to the humiliation of a lady who wore jewelry inherited from the silence of history. Still holding the cups, Amara read the paragraph in French. It was a quote from Simone de Beauvoir, about dignity. She translated it, calmly, word by word, with correct intonation, without theatrics, just truth. And when she finished, someone swallowed hard. The lady hadn't expected that. No one had. But Amara had. Because she knew the world is full of traps disguised as tests, and that true intelligence isn't in answering to win, but in answering to exist, without apologizing for being alive. Lucille flushed. She fidgeted with her brooch, tried to laugh, but her mouth trembled. Where did you learn that?" she asked with a false disdain that could no longer hide her fear. Amara simply replied, "In the margins, where you don't usually look." And then she turned, delivered the coffee to another table and continued her shift, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. A silent earthquake, a crack in pride, a shattered mirror. In the back corridor between the glass washing machine and sacks of flour, Amara leaned against the wall. She took a deep breath, felt her heart beating between her teeth. It wasn't anger. It was the weight of every time she'd been treated as less. And of every time she decided not to let that define her. God was seeing everything. He always had. At the end of the shift, the manager called Amara. There was an envelope on the counter. It was an invitation. The local university was hosting a panel on language power and invisibility. One of the speakers had fallen ill, and someone, one of the customers from that morning, had recommended Amara's name. "You were recommended with enthusiasm," the manager said, unable to hide her pride. Amara read the sender's name, Dr. Eliseo Miranda, full professor. He had been there that morning, sitting in the shadows, watching. That night, Amara arrived home exhausted, but before lying down, she sat on the edge of her bed and opened the notebook where she'd been writing since she was 12. She jotted down a sentence, "Today I won without shouting." Beside it, a underlined verse, "The Lord exalts the humble and brings down the proud." She didn't want to be famous, nor to prove anything to anyone. She just wanted to live with dignity, and perhaps to teach other girls to do the same, because deep down she knew the world wouldn't change in a day, but every day someone could choose not to bow. And that was already the beginning of a new world. The next morning, she passed by the same cafe and looked through the window. Senora Lucille wasn't there, but there were other people, other tables, other stories ready to begin. And she now knew her own place, not as someone waiting for permission, but as someone who recognizes the ground beneath her own feet. The university was an old building, with tall windows and creaking staircases worn by time. Amara arrived early. She carried a simple bag on her shoulders and the same calm in her eyes that had accompanied her in the cafe. But inside, her heart beat with the weight of someone who knows what's at stake. It wasn't just a lecture. It was a crossing. A threshold between the place where they'd always put her, behind the counter at the back of the room, outside the discourse, and the place where they were now giving her a voice. She climbed the steps with steady strides, feeling the curious glances of some colleagues turn toward her. She was too young, too ordinary, too black, to be among the names listed in that folder printed with golden letters. But there was her name, and no one had put it there out of charity. She had earned that space with sweat, silence, and hidden wisdom, the kind that doesn't shine in shop windows, but endures in the dark. Backstage in the auditorium, Professor Eliseo awaited her with a smile that seemed more like reverence than courtesy. "You reminded me of my mother," he said, gently squeezing her hand. She also translated the world in silence, but the world never translated her back. Amara smiled, unsure how to respond, but she understood everything. The room filled up. The event had been advertised on the city's radio. Students, professors, curious onlookers, ordinary people and important people. They all came. They all wanted to see. Some wanted to be impressed, others to doubt. But Amara hadn't prepared for any of them. She was thinking of the girls who served tables while memorizing words. She thought of the mothers who wake before the sun to sustain silent homes. She thought of herself, and of the corridors she'd crossed in silence. When her name was announced, there was a moment of hesitation, a murmur, some whispers, but she didn't stop. She stepped onto the stage like someone climbing a hill, feeling the weight and the promise in her feet. She placed her papers on the table, took a deep breath and spoke. Not with rehearsed boldness, but with carved truth. Words aren't just sounds. They're homes we live in, or prisons we're placed in. I grew up hearing phrases that limited me. But I learned over time that language can also be a map, a way back to oneself. The audience fell silent. Some leaned forward. She spoke of codes hidden in accents, of the shame taught to black girls when they mispronounce something, and of the strength born when they decide to speak anyway. She quoted texts, quoted life. She told of the night she read Baudelaire under the kitchen sink, of the letter she translated for an illiterate lady who needed help understanding her electric bill, and of how every gesture, every small act of translation, was also an act of survival, of faith, because those who translate the world refuse to accept it as it is, she said, and then fell silent. Timid applause came first. Then, like a restrained wave breaking, the auditorium rose. But she didn't smile with vanity. She merely bowed her head slightly, like someone offering something, and then withdrawing. Backstage, Professor Eliseo embraced her with misty eyes. Today many people heard what they pretended not to see. Later, outside the university, Amara walked down the street with the sky tinged orange. Her shoes hurt, but her entire body seemed to pulse with gratitude. That's when she heard someone call her name. She turned. It was a woman in a simple blouse, her eyes full of tears. "You don't know me, but I know you. I was there today. I have a daughter, 17 years old. She writes poems, but she doesn't show them to anyone. Today when I got home, she was listening to your lecture on the radio, and she told me, 'Mom, maybe I can write with my full name now.'" Amara held back her tears. She reached out her hand, but the woman was already embracing her, a warm, tight embrace, like those that tell us, "Don't stop." Then the woman left, and Amara stood there on the sidewalk, watching the city lights come on one by one, like small, silent blessings. In the days that followed, nothing changed spectacularly. She continued at the cafe, now with a few more curious glances. Some colleagues started asking for help with translations. The manager, somewhat awkwardly, said that if she needed a recommendation letter, she'd write it with pride. And the customers? Some ignored her. Others smiled more than before. But Senora Lucille didn't return, until on a rainy Friday she walked in. She wore a blue scarf on her head and moved more slowly than the last time. She sat in the same spot, opened the same newspaper. Amara saw her from afar, felt her stomach twist, but she approached with the same posture as always, neither challenging nor bowing. Lucille looked at her, and for the first time her eyes seemed to search for something. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps understanding. "Waitress." Her voice was low. Amara leaned in, waiting for the order, but what came was different. "Can you help me understand this text here?" She pointed to a chronicle in Spanish. "I want to learn." Silence settled between them, but this time it was a different kind of silence. A new space. A space for starting over. Amara nodded. She pulled up a chair and sat beside her. And there, in that discreet corner of an unremarkable cafe, two women separated by everything, time, color, power, history, began to meet through language. Words that once wounded, now stitched. Later, Amara would write about it in her notebook. There are things only silence explains. And there are victories only forgiveness sustains. With each encounter she understood something new, that intelligence isn't about proving, it's about understanding. That power isn't about humiliating, it's about making space. And that dignity isn't what the world gives us, it's what we carry even when the world denies us. Time passed, the shifts continued, the cold arrived, and the city kept its rhythm. But there was a new sound in the air, subtle but profound, the sound of doors opening where walls once stood. On Christmas Eve, the cafe closed early. The city was dressed in faint lights and hope disguised as last-minute shopping. The few employees said goodbye with quick hugs and promises of "see you next year." Amara stayed behind. She wanted to clean the marble counter alone, as she always did, with the same care one uses to touch something that's been part of their story. Her hands moved slowly over the surface, not from tiredness, but like someone saying goodbye to a place without leaving traces of pain. The radio played an old version of Silent Night in the background, almost whispered, almost a lament. And in that sound, she allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment. She remembered Christmas 7 years ago when there were no gifts, but there was hot soup and her mother holding her hand saying, "You'll still sit in places they never imagined you would." She remembered the first time she heard a French poem on the old radio at home, and how she tried to mimic it, repeating the words in front of the mirror. She remembered the night she cried washing dishes at a lavish wedding, and even so whispered, "Thank you, God," through her tears. And now here, alone in the empty cafe, she knew none of those moments were in vain. Outside the fogged-up window, the city remained alive. But for her, time had stopped racing. She no longer needed to prove herself. She had won, not with trophies, not with headlines, but with presence, with dignity, with a kind of wisdom that doesn't shout, only endures. Because sometimes the greatest response to humiliation isn't revenge. It's the silence of someone who no longer needs to react. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. The cafe door opened, the bell rang softly, and there in the doorway, holding a package, was Lucille. She wore a simple coat and tired eyes, but her face was different. There was no arrogance, there was time. Time in her eyes, time in her hands, time in her voice, which now came out like someone asking permission. I know you're closing, but I wanted to give you something." Amara, surprised, merely nodded. Lucille approached, extending the package with trembling hands. "It's just a book. My husband received this copy decades ago on a trip to Europe. I never read it. It was always there, decorating the shelf. But I think it was waiting for you." Amara took the package, felt its weight, the old smell of paper. She opened it. It was an original edition of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo, in French. She didn't know what to say, but Lucille continued, "You didn't humiliate me, and I tried. I want you to know that, That day I wasn't testing your intelligence. I was challenging my own ignorance, and I lost. But it was the best defeat of my life." Amara held the book like someone holding an altar, not for its value, but for the gesture. And in that moment, without rehearsal, she said with serenity, "Sometimes the deepest lesson isn't in what we teach, but in what we awaken in others." Lucille smiled and cried. Then she turned with slow steps and left. Amara never saw her again. But that night stayed, like a beautiful scar, like an invisible altar in the center of a modest cafe. A few months later, the video of Amara's lecture went viral. It was shared by educators, artists, mothers, black girls from the countryside, young Latinas from American suburbs. The world suddenly began to listen, not with euphoria, but with respect. They invited her to new events. She received scholarships. She returned to university, but she never stopped working. Even when she started teaching, she still returned to the cafe from time to time, to serve, to remember, to give thanks. Once, someone asked her what she felt the day she was challenged with the phrase, "If you're so smart, then translate." She thought for a while, then answered, "I felt the world was offering me a choice, to be a reflection of pain or to be an answer to it. I chose to be an answer." Silence. And then she continued, "That woman's phrase wasn't about language. It was about power. But my God is a God who takes phrases meant to wound and turns them into bridges." And so she went on, translating, yes, but also transforming, with firmness, faith, and silent fire. Because some victories don't make headlines, they simply endure. Like a young, humble black woman who was once humiliated in public and responded with dignity without raising her voice. A woman who didn't ask for permission, but built a path, who didn't wait for the world to accept her, to be who she already was. And if today you hear this story and recognize yourself, if you've ever been challenged by someone who thought they could measure your worth with a phrase, remember, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You just need to keep going, because God is seeing everything, and He doesn't miss a single comma of what they write about you. He reads even the margins, and when the time comes, He Himself will turn the page.